Welcome to Transition Talks, Business Exit and Retirement Strategies with Josh Ackerman. Get ready to be immersed in real-life experiences and strategies of business owners who have transitioned their enterprises, whether by selling or handing over the reins to the next generation. Through candid conversations and expert insights, Josh aims to provide practical tips and proven techniques to tackle the complexities of succession planning. Let's embark on your next chapter together.
Hello and welcome to the podcast Transition Talks, hosted by Josh Ackerman. Josh, my friend, it's good to see you. How you been?
I've been very good. How are you doing, Bill?
I'm doing well, thanks. I am doing well. I'm done with winter. We're taping this in February, and truth be told, I've got major seasonal affective disorder. So it's good to see you. It's putting me in a good mood.
Well, that's good. Glad to hear it.
So what are we talking about today?
So today we're talking about kind of the other side of business exit. We've talked with Jeff in the last episode where we talked about getting ready to sell your business.
Yeah.
And sort of the nuts and bolts and the numbers and the spreadsheets.
Right. And
today we're going to talk about the other side, which is kind of scary statistics. And these statistics are from PricewaterhouseCoopers. They are, they've got to be 10, 15 years old at this point. But the study they did said that 1 in 3 business owners were unhappy 1 year after the sale. They were unhappy with the transaction that they had undergone.
In what way? They thought they could have gotten more money or what?
I think it's going to come out in several different ways, right? They have cashed a check, metaphorically or literally, that at the time was a good enough check for them to sign.
Okay.
Right? They got a deal that they were happy with at the time. And then they decide or realize that, no, maybe they didn't want to do that. Maybe they'd like to take that back. I've got a good friend in town that I'm trying to get on the podcast, but a good friend who's an estate planning attorney. And he's done a lot of work with helping his clients, the business owner, get ready to do the deal and sign contracts to transition out of the business. And Kevin has told me this story 3 or 4 times when we get together with different fictionalized names. And the story is, client comes to him and says, hey, I'd like to get out of the business. Here's the offer. There's contracts back and forth and legalese and all of that. And then there's a check. And then there's a signing ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
And the story, as he tells it, it's 2 days after the signing ceremony. And the client calls him and says, I think I made a mistake. I don't want to do this. And to me, that's the interesting question.
That doesn't sound like a financial problem, Josh.
I don't think it is necessarily a financial problem. I think there are a couple of other factors at play. And if we think about, there's 2 forces that are acting on the owner when they decide to sell the business.
Okay.
And those could be broken down into push factors, things that are pushing the owner out of the business, and pull factors, something pulling the owner from the business to something else. The push would be the owner that wakes up and decides on a given Tuesday morning, it's snowy and cold outside. They wake up and they say, you know what? I'm not doing that anymore.
Okay.
Today is not the day. I'm done. Or there's a health change of the owner or the owner's family, and the owner looks around and says, I don't have time for this anymore. I have other priorities.
Mm-hmm.
There's a change in the business market, and the part of the business that the owner loved is being phased out for some reason. It's being overtaken by robots. And the owner says, this isn't fun. I don't want to fight this anymore. I'm done.
Okay.
Those are push. The pull would be the owner who has a clear idea of where they want to go. They have thought about what does the next step look like, and why is the next step bright and shiny and attractive enough that I want to leave where I am and go to that new place. And that could be, again, that could be anything. That could be they want to go get really involved with their church. They want to get really involved with a political issue. They have grandchildren in North Carolina, and they want to go see the grandchildren whenever they want for as long as they want. They've been promising their spouse that trip to Paris for 25 years and never done it, and now is the time. But it is, and in a lot of ways, this parallels individual financial planning. When I started doing financial planning, the software we used at the time would take the client's current income that we'd enter, and it would reduce that current income by 30%, and it would project that income with inflation out to life expectancy. And what we were saying to the client was, you're going to retire on this day, you're going to make X, and you're going to do whatever it is you do, shuffleboard, golf, whatever, and then you're going to die. Well, no one's going to make any kind of a change willingly in order to get to the land of 70%. Right? That's not interesting to anyone.
No.
Right?
Fair point. There's a very fair point.
Yeah. That's not bright and shiny. There's nothing attractive about that. So I think the biggest piece would be to look at what are the reasons that you want to get out of this job, this business, and then what are the things that you have set up on the other side post-exit that will make that an attractive place to be. And I think humans being human, there is going to be a combination of pushes and pulls with most people.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, what you're talking about, or at least what I hear you talking about, is the emotional and psychological impact of selling a business and realizing you may have gotten really good money for it, but now what are you going to do, and how do you adjust, and what comes after?
What comes after? So some of the questions that you can look at are questions around when you're looking at an exit, what kind of an exit are you willing to consider? And by kind of exit, I mean, is it a transaction where you're going to meet the new owners in the conference room, you're going to sign some documents, they're going to sign some documents, they're going to hand you a duffel bag full of cash, and you're going to get up and walk out, never to be seen again? Or is it a negotiation, a transaction where you're going to retain some ownership? You're not actually selling 100%, you're selling 70%, and you've got a negotiated role in the new company doing something that you're really good at, and you're going to spend time in a slightly different position, but with interesting things to get up and do every day, and the new owners intend to sell the business 5 to 6 years from now. And when that happens, you'll get what the business calls the second bite of the apple, meaning they go sell the new business and you get paid for the shares you still own in the business. You get a second check.
Okay. Yeah.
Are you going to leave no ownership, but you're going to have a consulting contract? You see where we're going. You've got several different
I do.
ways.
And this takes some deliberation. This takes intention.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's several different ways that you could leave the business. And studies have shown the owner who is more willing to entertain different options tends to be happier. And that is because the owner who wakes up and says on our given cold and drizzly February morning and says, I'm done. I will not go back to work. You can't make me. That person is very strongly in the realm of push.
Yeah.
Right? They want out. They want out now. The client, the owner who is more interested in, well, the future could look a couple of different ways. I could see myself doing A, B, or C. That's possible. Mm-hmm. That person is more interested in looking at things that could pull them out of owning the business. They could say, if all I had to do was talk to clients and drum up new business, I love that part. And if I could do that, I'd stick around longer.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, this does have a parallel in some ways that strikes me that, I know plenty of people who are at that point in their life, in their career, where they could retire. They could afford to retire even. And they don't want to do it. And they're not sure about doing it. And they don't give it much thought beyond, well, it's time to do it. And then they find themselves suddenly in no man's land.
And that definitely brings us to the next one. That was nicely done. You didn't even know where I was going. And
I had no idea, but I could feel that.
So the next one is, and this is an exercise that you can have the owner do, is you say you are arranging or your spouse is arranging your birthday party. And who would he or she invite to this party? And you look at the guest list and you add points to a score for people that are not part of the business. And you deduct points for people that are part of the business, that work in the company, that are clients, that are suppliers. And what we're looking at here, and I've told this story on the podcast before, but we're looking for the acquaintance of mine who had sold a business, was in a restaurant locally, texted me on a Wednesday afternoon and said, I'm the richest guy in the building and I'm having lunch by myself. Because his social circle was the people he worked with.
Yeah.
And that had been his social circle since he started the company 27 years prior. And he didn't have people, he didn't have that network. And so when you're talking to someone about how happy are you going to be after this transition, a real question is, who do you know that you like hanging out with that has time to go to lunch on Wednesday, that isn't working for the same company or a different company, that isn't spending 6 months a year in Florida, that's still around? Who are the folks you have to hang out with? And I have said to several clients of all walks at about this age, about the late 50s, early 60s, spend less time worried about the 401k plan and more time making some friends.
I can see where this might be an eye-opening moment for a lot of people.
Well, and we as humans are designed to have a certain amount of stress. We do well with sort of a base level of stress because it gives us something to struggle against.
Yeah.
And we're wired to have something to struggle against.
No, I can see that. I feel like, yep, I understand that.
There are certainly exceptions, but that's most people. And so you start talking to the business owner and saying, what are you going to do next? And a great client talked about it and said he retired in May, and we were talking about his retirement. And I said, what are you thinking? And he said, Josh, it isn't real yet. I'm going to have the longest summer vacation I've had since I was in junior high school because I'm going to have the entire summer off. And in September, mid-October, I'm going to need some help because it's going to get really weird.
Well, it's nice he knew that.
I thought it was fantastic that he knew that. Yeah. And so I think that's the kind of conversation that you want to be having. And this is classic, take the dog for a walk, stand in the kitchen and wash some dishes, split some firewood, do something, but ask yourself the question, what do I want to do next? And for a lot of people, certainly not all, a lot of people won't have much of an answer. And I would say that's okay. That's not surprising that you don't have an answer because it's a question you've never asked. And no one has ever asked you, what do you want to do next, with no ulterior motive of you want to come work on this project that I'm shepherding through the corporation. Do you want to be on this group? Do you want to, this is really, you're asking the question, and depending on your personal circumstance, and this is another slightly puzzling factor, you get someone who has sold the business and they've sold the business for a bunch of money. Whatever a bunch of money means to them.
Whatever that amount is. Yeah.
Yeah. But the bunch is a bunch of money, could be defined as enough money to do pretty much anything I could think of. Fly to spend the winter in Florida. Well, you could do that.
Okay.
Go on 2 ski trips a year. Yep, you could do that. Go on, and you start adding things onto this list. And if I, the financial planner looking at your numbers, say, yeah, you can do that, and you can do that too, and you can do that too, we get to a very delicate spot because psychologically, you're used to having the limitation of money. I don't have the money. When you have the business, I certainly don't have the time.
Right.
The business needs me. I have to be here because this might break, that might break, someone might call me. And I'm sitting here telling you, one, you have the money. Depending on your personal situation, you may probably have the time. And no one's calling you. You don't need to be here, wherever here is. You can go do whatever you want, wherever you want. And that removes the very familiar constraint of the business that provides us with an identity and provides us with that place of people need us. I need to watch this. I need to control this. I need to be in charge of this. And then we say, nope, we're going to take that off. Now you have the ability to go do whatever you want to do. And that's a difficult conversation to have with yourself. If you haven't done that, that's important.
Well, how do you get clients of yours to understand the need for that conversation? Is that something that you can do for them, or is it a realization that they need to come to themselves?
I think it's a combination. I think it is a combination of asking the question the first time or the second time and saying, help me understand what we want to do. And this is another classic. Two of my favorite clients that would come in for meetings late afternoon, and they would each come from work, and we would sit and talk for an hour, hour and a half, do whatever we were doing. And they would go to dinner immediately following our get together. Mm-hmm. We'd finish 6:30, and they'd go to dinner together. And they told me they did some of their best financial planning at dinner after talking to me, because those conversations about what do you want to do, I'd already brought them up. I'd already broached the subject. They didn't have to figure out how in a 30, 40-year marriage where they'd never had a conversation about what do you want to be when you grow up, right? Yeah. How do you ask that question? But if they'd been in the room with me and I'd asked the question, then it was easier to kind of bring it up at dinner and say, boy, what in the world is Josh talking about? Why did he ask, what do you think if we did this? And the next time I would get together with them, they would come in and say, boy, we were talking after the last visit, and we came up with, we'd really like to do this. Two clients came in and said, we'd like to travel. This was during COVID, during lockdown, and they said, we'd like to travel when the world opens back up. We'd like to put money into the travel budget. And the wife said, and I will not stay in a youth hostel in Paris.
Amen.
So we're going to need to put a lot of money into the travel budget.
Right.
And that was the conversation. It was not the first time we'd had that discussion. It probably wasn't the third time. But it was I think it is the re-engaging with that question, revisiting that question enough that the client thinks about it themselves outside of the room with me.
Right.
They think about it some. The next time I bring it up, maybe their subconscious has been working on it, but all of a sudden they go, oh, you know what I really want to do? I want to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they're very excited. They're very animated. Their energy kind of goes up. And I write that down and I say, okay, that's new. Let's talk about that some. Where'd that come from? And then we come back to it. And we kind of revisit that. Is that still the goal? And that's and this is a little inside baseball, but that is the difference between financial planning designed to sell a product, right? We're going to do a financial plan, and at the end of the financial plan, I'm going to tell you and everybody else that you need to buy this annuity. Versus, we're going to do financial planning. Every plan we ever do is only going to be about 60% right, if we're lucky.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because life happens, things change, and the value is in the iterations, the repeat conversations to see where things have changed and to get new clarity. That's the value of the whole process.
Yeah, and it's funny, you have talked about this process before. You've had guests talk about this process. It's certainly not a new conversation. I guess what I walk away from, like, having had this conversation with you today and in the past, is that it's a necessary conversation, not necessarily because of the money, right? The money's nice, but it's necessary so that you're emotionally and you're emotionally happy. You're satisfied with where you are and what you're doing, and you don't have another wake up in the middle of February on a cold, dreary day and go, "What did I do? Where am I going? I don't know what's happening."
Well, and yes, and to the money, to give the money its due, which given my job, I probably ought to.
Well, yeah.
I have worked with clients who were discussing an internal offer to buy their business. And I had looked at their expenses. Importantly, I knew what they took home as a paycheck from the business. Mm-hmm. And I knew what expenses they ran through the company books. And there's excellent arguments from a tax planning perspective for the business owner to run everything they can through the business.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not saying that that's a bad idea.
Nope.
But these guys were looking at an offer that was going to pay each of them 2.5 years worth of income. And neither one of them had the assets to maintain their lifestyle after the 2.5 years. And in their minds, because they were thinking take-home pay, they looked at that offer and they probably saw 4 to 5 years of take-home.
Sure.
And we were in day-long meetings with CPAs and attorneys and all sorts of people. And we're literally in the parking garage after the day of meetings. And I said, guys, I don't understand what either one of you is going to do. You've been self-employed for 25 years. Neither one of you is employable at this point. You guys have been the decision makers essentially your entire careers.
Yeah.
And I don't see either one of you working for somebody. And they hadn't done, and one of the partners confirmed this after the fact, neither one of them really understood how much money they were really taking out of the business, and that taking the offer, which was a big number, wasn't going to solve their problem because they didn't have outside assets to carry them the rest of their retirement.
Gotcha.
And so they had to kind of readjust their expectations. So that's the one numbers piece that I do think is vital here, is when you're looking at, I'm going to get out of the business, and you are the owner who woke up on the Tuesday morning and said, I'm done, let me out, that owner is much more likely to take the offer that looks good on paper without considering what comes after that number, and doesn't understand this is what my lifestyle costs in real dollars. And we say, okay, now, Mr. Owner, you need to go buy a car. You need to pay for the gas. You need to pay for the maintenance. You need to pay for the insurance. And just start adding those things up. And it adds up pretty quickly.
Yes.
So
yeah, you've talked about that. And for those of you who listen to the podcast, go back and listen to some earlier episodes, because Josh has talked about this in the past. There are things that you may not be aware of. And money, yes. To your point, money, of course, is really important. But this podcast, this particular episode has been about the fact that there are things beyond the money,
right,
that you need to be cognizant of, you need to be aware of, you need to have at least thought about, if not had discussions about. And, to that end, Josh, for people who are listening to this episode who are thinking that you sound like somebody they might be able to talk with or might be able to have a conversation with, what's the best way for them to reach out and get a hold of you and possibly have a conversation?
Best way is to go to the website, contextfinancial.com, and our contact information, email, and phone numbers is all there. And pick your method of contact and reach out.
Beautiful. And I do want to emphasize, you're not committing to anything.
Absolutely
you can have
not.
that conversation.
That's right.
It doesn't make you get married right away, as it
That's
were.
right. That's right. Yes, I don't bring anything figuratively or literally to the conversation except for something to write on.
Good.
So
that's fantastic.
Nothing up my sleeves.
The other thing you can do, people, if you're listening to this podcast and you're not a subscriber, is become a subscriber. And that part is really easy. You just hit the follow button. Now, the beauty of that is that every time Josh has a new episode, you're notified. You're notified. You give it a listen. And the other thing this is a personal request. If you like this podcast, if you find it useful, you find it helpful, you find it informative, tell people about it. Let them know. Say, hey, I think this podcast is really interesting. I think you might find it interesting, because word of mouth promotion is a terrific tool of promotion, and we would very much appreciate it. So until next time, I'm Bill Tucker on behalf of Josh and everybody at Context Financial. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Transition Talks, Business Exit and Retirement Strategies with Josh Ackerman from Context Financial. Are you a business owner looking to sell or make a transition? Connect with Josh on social media using today's show notes links. You might just be his next guest. To ensure you don't miss a new episode, please click the follow button. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Context Financial. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.